Well, right after I do a video on Biden's executive actions, a document was leaked giving us a glimpse into the Fed plan to address these issues. We saw a 107-page hellscape of administrative wiggle-wordery in what seems to be an attempt to do a bunch of weird stuff to the gun market. What exactly was in there? Well, I sat there and read the whole thing, so you didn't have to. Let's boil it down.
While the host of Fuddbusters is a lawyer, he is not your lawyer. If you pay him, maybe, either way you slice it, the video that you are about to watch is not to be construed as legal advice.
Alright, so this past week, Stephen Gutowski at The Reload dropped a leaked internal ATF proposed rulemaking, this being the first of the Biden executive actions that we were told to expect in 30 days. Now, let's be clear, this is an internal document and wasn't intended to be released. They might change some or even all of it, but I think it gives us a very valuable look at what might be going on inside the ATF's mechanized insect brain. Let's talk first about the rulemaking process, though, because I think it's really important to know what's going on here. You might be wondering just how the heck the ATF and other limp-wristed, unelected chicken nugget scoons are able to have any kind of power. After all, our Constitution doesn't mention any tyrannical alphabet soup agencies. Well, administrative agencies, like the ATF, get the power to make regulations from laws passed by Congress and from the President delegating his authority to an agency. The agencies must follow an open, public process when they come out with new regulations as commanded by the Administrative Procedures Act. Agencies just love screwing this up, which gives us plenty of opportunities to sue them. You know I love that part. You love it too. After all, suing is part of the American experience. Sometimes, when they are feeling generous, administrative agencies will publish an advance notice of proposed rulemaking in the Federal Register. This is basically an informal invitation to scream at the federal government. They take a look at the comments and generally ignore them. Once the government has decided what it wants, it publishes a notice of proposed rulemaking. This is the official invitation to scream at the federal government. The proposed rule and the public comments we submit on it are the basis for the final rule. The amount of time we have to submit comments varies. It's typically from 30 to 180 days. So let's dive into this extra thick 107-page leaked document. What exactly are we dealing with here? From the outset, it's obvious that the ATF is trying to create new law rather than simply trying to define framer-receiver like they're supposed to. Instead, they're spending a great deal of time creating and then defining brand new terms. Remember, their sole responsibility here is supposed to be saying what a framer-receiver is. Their response to this is to blast off about complete weapon and privately made firearm, and then the word readily, which they're trying to have carry a lot of weight. All of these new terms are recycled repeatedly throughout new interpretations of other terms in what effectively creates a brand new GCA and NFA. Their use of readily here does carry a lot of weight for the agency's interpretations, as we'll see. So let's dive into this definitional stuff. Lots of people have been confused as to whether ATF is saying firearms will now have 1 receiver, 2, or 20. Well, if the ATF gets its way, the answer is yes. ATF spends a lot of time saying how it wants to preserve its previous determinations of what is a framer receiver, and seems to be of the opinion that one piece ought to be considered such, rather than multiple. They also do some interesting mental gymnastics, claiming that the court has erroneously decided that the previous definition did not cover many firearm receivers, and yet they tacitly admit their old definition was based on revolvers and break-open shotguns. Yeah, try figuring that one out. Also, that old definition came out in 1971, long after self-loading pistols and striker guns were common on the market. It is also incredibly fixated with ghost guns, spending pages bemoaning the relatively rare instances where FFLs come into possession with homemade guns, crying about how unserialized guns are passing hands through FFLs, even though it would already be illegal to do so for the purpose of selling to the FFL. The answer to this made-up problem that nobody asked the ATF about is to compel FFLs to mark a homemade gun whenever one passes through their hands, be it for sale or transfer. They even invented an adorable new marking system just for that. In simple terms, the new marking system would be the transferring FFL's abbreviated FFL number followed by an arbitrary serial number. Plastic frames would need to have a metal plate inserted for this. Around page 18, ATF begins cutting to the meat of the new rule. They refer directly to the buy, build, shoot kit issue, contending that these kits are too readily convertible into firearms rather than hinging on frame or receiver. Bear in mind that the law requires the item to be a weapon first and foremost. I'm not sure how something incomplete can be a weapon, but let's not let those inconvenient semantics get in our way. After all, the government doesn't actually care what the law says. So their proposed solution to this is to simply ignore the text of the law by grafting onto the present definition of firearm a specific reference to kits that may be assembled, completed, converted, or restored to expel a projectile. That's a whole lot more than the plug barrel starter guns the law was actually designed to target here, but whatever. As for parts kits, ATF says the definition would not include kits where the receiver is destroyed, but they make a little fork-tongue change here, by referring to each part defined as a frame or receiver rather than that part. This basically leaves them the option to declare more than one part the frame or receiver and thus nuke the parts kit. Their actual proposed definition of frame or receiver starts at page 21 and is now a multi-stage deal. It begins with a non-exhaustive list of examples of parts that ATF has already considered to be the receiver, followed by supplements. Of course, right off the bat, when we look at their list, there's a flip-flop, where they're now lumping AR-70s in with AR-15s, saying the lower is the receiver, where the AR-70's upper had traditionally been the receiver, kind of like SIG 550s. Whoops. In the new textual definition, it basically includes any part that could hold a fire control part. They define fire control part as the hammer, bolt or breech block, cylinder, trigger mechanism, firing pin, striker, or slide rails. So yeah, the definition on its own could cover just about any major component of a modern firearm. It seems to me the intention is that the ATF will consider just about every part of a gun the receiver unless and until they make a determination on that specific design. And this isn't just me blowing smoke either. They flat out say that. Under split or modular receiver section, they explicitly state that firearms with more than one component that contains fire controls, each component is a receiver unless and until the ATF decides on its favorite part. This would effectively make submitting new designs to ATF a requirement before any parts could be sold, a massive departure from what we're used to. Despite all this, and creating a completely unlimited definition of frame or receiver, ATF is saying that it does not want to affect existing classifications that specify a single component as the frame or receiver. So it'll publish a list of firearms it has already seen, and for those models, importers and manufacturers have the deep privilege of continuing to know what the heck a receiver is. Aside from that, though, ATF is also saying that if it isn't specifically declared, any firearm part with a serial number on it must be considered a frame or receiver. This crap is all over the place. They're flip-flopping aggressively between, oh, don't worry, it's all the same, and oh, and everything in the world is a receiver. Next up, the whole ghost gun dealie. They toss in a new definition of partially complete receivers, which they define basically as a part that is clearly identifiable as an unfinished gun part. This is really loosely defined, having the word readily doing all the heavy lifting, and including examples up to a full 8-hour day in an equipped machine shop as something that would be readily completed. There's no doubt here what they're trying to accomplish, and that's the murder of polymer 80 and 80% AR lowers. You guys know I don't mince words or fearmonger, but that's what's going on here. Well, how about 3D printing? Well, to be frank with you, it looks to me like it skates by mostly unscathed, at least for now. So as always, check out my affiliate link and get yourself a printer. Use it to print a spice rack or something. Other changes here include requiring FFLs to keep records for as long as their business exists rather than just for 20 years, and demanding that where firearms have multiple frames with non-matching serials, that each serial be recorded in the FFL log. Hooray. There's also something that's kind of okay about suppressors, where now they're calling the outer tube, or a component of the outer tube, the frame or receiver of the suppressor, which is settling a previous interpretation that got people confused as to whether they needed to serialize every single little part of each suppressor. So what can we do about this? Well, let's talk about that next. For the agency to go ahead with a final rule, it has to be based on the record, including the comments that we shouted at it. So you might be thinking, well, how can we challenge an agency rulemaking? I'm so glad you asked. There are 3 main ways to challenge a rulemaking. The first is a notice and comment violation, basically arguing that the government failed to give proper notice or a meaningful opportunity for the public to participate. ATF is required to give us plebs enough time to comment on the rule, And while there's no minimum time, the courts look at the amount of time the feds allowed compared to the severity of the law in determining whether it's reasonable under the circumstances. Here's the big hook for you, though. The agency must be able to demonstrate that they considered all significant comments which raised major points with the agency's proposals, comments that, if heeded, would have required a change in the proposed rule. In the case of legislative rulemakings, failure to follow these requirements means the rule is invalid. So be sure to say something significant. The next thing we can challenge is arbitrary and capricious agency action. Of course, we know the ATF is literally incapable of being anything but arbitrary and capricious, so let's look at the standard the Supreme Court laid out for determining what is arbitrary and capricious. Actions are arbitrary and capricious if they rely on factors Congress did not intend the feds to consider, if they fail to consider an important aspect of the problem, if they offer an explanation that contradicts the evidence, or if its position is so pants-on-head moronic that it could in no way be explained by a simple difference in viewpoint. The third option is agency action that runs counter to the law. Basically, the APA calls for agency action to be set aside whenever it is contrary to a constitutional right and or in excess of the powers granted to it by the statute. This might seem like the most attractive, since it obviously tightens the noose on our ever-dwindling right to keep and bear arms, but you have to remember something. The federal judiciary is a hive mind of subterranean invertebrate humanoids that generally consider the Second Amendment to be an inkblot. I do think there's a strong argument that some of this rulemaking is beyond the scope of the law. After all, ATF is trying to inject rather than simply interpret terms of the GCA. ATF is importing terms from other sections of the law to try to transform the simple phrase frame a receiver into frame a receiver or something that looks like one or that might one day be one, or literally every part of a gun if we haven't seen it yet. As someone who engages in pretentious wordsmithing for a career, I can tell you that's some prime grade advanced BS. So that's all on this so far. We'll have to see what they do. We got to keep an eye on it and see what comes out as the final rule. If it comes out primarily like this, you can bet your booty we're going to be commenting on it. Let me just say I really appreciate you guys watching and subscribing. It makes a huge difference. If you want to support me more than that, I started up a Patreon and a Subscribestar. I've added benefits like a patron-only podcast, a Discord, and there's surely more to come. This kind of support will help enable me to make more content more regularly, something I'd really love to be able to do. There's also a link to the Fuddbusters sticker and the Magic ATF ball in the description below. Thank you all so much for watching to the end and for your support. I'll see you next time, or if you join up on Patreon or Subscribestar, I'll see you in the Discord. Remember, the anti-side has been working long and hard passing laws and trying to make more. Anything more than minimum compliance is self-regulation. Y'all take care.